Weather, only on Action News.
Armed, but with no bullets. One man's story in Vietnam. That's next on Perspective New Jersey. Hi, I'm Nora Muchanic, and welcome to Perspective New Jersey. We hear lots of stories about military superstars, special forces, the Navy SEALs, but what about the regular Joe who finds himself in the middle of a war with a gun but no bullets? Well, that's the story my guest today has written. Dennis Papp of Hamilton has authored a book called Fear Was My Only Weapon about his experiences in Vietnam. He was, if you will, an unlikely soldier in some ways, which we'll explain in just a minute. But first, Dennis, thanks for being here and sharing your story with us.
It's my pleasure.
Start us off by telling us what branch of the service you are in and what your job was leading up to your deployment to Vietnam.
I was in the Army, and I was a personnel clerk in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I was a battery clerk, one in the artillery, as like Radar O'Reilly or Klinger on TV, and basically with myself, the first sergeant, and the CO, we ran the unit. So I took care of all the paperwork that was involved there.
So you're on the mainland. You're nowhere near Vietnam.
That's right. Oklahoma's nowhere near it.
So with 9 months left to your hitch in the Army, or left in your hitch, the Army says to you, you're going to Vietnam. You know, what did you think?
How do I tell my wife? She was living with me off base in Oklahoma, and I had no idea of what to tell her. And eventually she found out when I was writing a letter to a buddy that was stationed in Germany. At the time I wrote Vietnam, she peeked over my shoulder to look at the letter. When she saw the word, she started screaming and crying and ran out of the room. So,
what are you thinking when you know you're going to Vietnam?
I hope that I will get home alive. I obviously didn't want to go there, but I was told you're going, so I went.
And this was with 9 months left?
With 9 months left.
What, if any, training did you receive? You went to boot camp, of course, right?
Right. I went through basic training, as everyone does, and then there was the AIT, Advanced Individual Training, which gave you training in the job, if you will, that you would have while you're in the service. When I got on orders, they gave us a few days of what they called RVN training, Republic of Vietnam, at Fort Sill, and it was just explaining how an M16 worked and a few other things like that, but no real infantry training.
Now, this is the thing that interests me about your book. You said that they handed you an M16, a rifle, but no bullets. Why not?
I don't know how to answer that, because we were told you're not getting any because you're just a dumb clerk, and I guess they were afraid we would shoot each other or ourselves, and they didn't want that to happen. When they finally gave us ammo, when we went on guard duty, we weren't allowed to lock and load a round into the M16, so if you pulled the trigger, nothing would happen. And if we saw something, we were not allowed to shoot at it unless we first picked up the field phone, called the officer of the day to get permission. And even when they saw the enemy out there, we were told not to fire.
Well, talk about how vulnerable you must have felt, or I shouldn't put words in your mouth. Did you, or did you feel like you were at risk?
I would say absolutely. It was crazy. I don't know how they could do that to anyone, even if we were just a bunch of clerks. Granted, we were in a main headquarters for the 9th Infantry Division, and we were basically secure, if you could ever be secure in a war zone, but you just didn't know what was going to happen.
What was the response from your superiors? Because I guess you would ask for ammo or ask to be armed?
We basically, the question was never asked because we were told we're not going to get any. And again, when I went on guard duty and was handed 8 magazines of ammo, we still were not allowed to fire or shoot or defend ourselves.
Were you at any time when you were in Vietnam, did you go out with the infantry at all, or it was all doing the radar O'Reilly jobs that you talked about before?
I really did not go out on any firefights or anything with the infantry guys. The men with the 9th Infantry who were doing the most of the fighting were down in Dong Tam in the Delta, about 90 miles south of us. But the one time that I did go out is when an officer decided men in the field were losing too much time coming up to us to get ID cards because you had to have one. So they took a clerk, me, and a photographer and sent us from base camp to base camp, still with an empty M16. So I had it, and it was worthless.
So your Vietnam experience is very different from a lot of the vets who were there.
That's true. Although there were tens of thousands of support soldiers there, a lot of them were still armed and had ammo. I don't know if it was an order of the 9th Infantry Division or our own base camp or what, but there were other guys there that experienced similar things but were able to defend themselves.
Well, this sort of brings us back to your title. Fear was my only weapon. Tell me about that.
Well, I guess the first time I thought about, I was a paper soldier in Vietnam diary, all the cliches, if you will. And then I realized when I start writing it that I stumbled on the words that the only thing I had to help defend myself was my fear. So hence the title. But there's the story of the enemy wore black pajamas. Well, everybody wore black pajamas, the Vietnamese, so you did not know who was on your side or not. You go to the post barber shop to get a haircut, one of the luxuries of life, and Vietnamese were cutting your hair. After Tet, which was the beginning or the end of January, there were many barbers missing, and I learned that they were killed during Tet, but they were not on our side. They were North Vietnamese regulars, or they were the Viet Cong, South Vietnamese that were sympathy to the Northern Allies. So in the daytime they cut your hair, at night they cut your throat.
We need to take a break. When we come back, more with Dennis Papp and his book, Fear Was My Only Weapon. Please stay with us. We're back and we're talking today with Dennis Papp, a Vietnam veteran from Hamilton Township, who's written a book, Fear Was My Only Weapon, about his experiences in Vietnam. He's sharing a story with us today. Dennis, this book has been described as something for regular guys, not superheroes or the specially trained, not blood and guts. That's by design?
Yes, because that was my story. I was not in firefights. I was not risking my life every day. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books written about war, various wars, and it's all the battles and blood and guts, and rightfully so. But there were tens of thousands of men and women that were in the service in a war that were just support soldiers and did not face the battles, did not face the enemy. And I wanted to tell the story of what it was like to, quote, just be there because of the indignities of war, of not having electricity, running water, showers, decent food, and things like that.
And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but what drove you to write this book now?
Well, actually, I've been writing it for 45 years since I came home from Vietnam, but with work and everything else, you write a little bit, put it aside, and write it a little. And now with the advent of self-publishing, I decided to finally get off my butt and do it. So over the last 2 years, I rewrote it many times, got it edited professionally by a friend, and then start working to get it to a publisher.
And you mentioned a moment ago about the indignities of war, and you talk about them in your book. Talk about the conditions that you lived under, that soldiers lived under in Vietnam.
Well, first of all, it was basically over 100 degrees during the day. You were lucky to get a shower if there was water. Many of us gave up our evening meal so that we could get somewhat warm water instead of no water at all, or ice water, what it amounted to. Because you sweated profusely, your body odor was not the most pleasant. You couldn't do very much about that. We would send our fatigues and clothes to be cleaned, but it was like beating them on the rock at the river because they came back smelling worse than when we got rid of them. Again, no electricity, so you couldn't do or say anything, entertain yourself, if you will, as far as, well, say, human waste removal. I mean, just having to burn it and dump it somewhere. You didn't flush a toilet. There were no toilets, and everything else like that.
And you mentioned Ho Chi Minh's revenge.
Right. Well, the so-called, because of taking the malaria tablet, you get the runs. Sometimes just eating improper food or beverages, you could end up with.
And some of the stuff you're talking about isn't even the worst of what came from this. A lot of soldiers came back from Vietnam with post-traumatic stress. Talk about the effect these conditions have on humans, have on soldiers.
Well, I know many of the guys that came back from Vietnam did not even want to talk about what happened over there. And it would be 10, 20, 30 years later, and finally a few words would come out. Others would talk about it a little more willingly. As far as the reactions, if a car backfired, you'd hit the ground because you were afraid. You just thought you were back there. Now, again, I did not go out in firefights, get shot at and everything all the time, so I could not appreciate what some of those men went through. And for them to have that on their mind all the time, and flashes of it and nightmares, it's just like any other, should we say, bad experience.
But even though you weren't in the middle of those firefights, I imagine it still had an effect on you.
It did. In some respects, I don't want to say a positive effect, but I more appreciated the idea of when I flipped the light switch, a light went on. When I turned a key in a car, the car started. To sit down and have a meal, to drink water, that I didn't have to go to a big tank that said potable water instead of non-potable. You didn't have to be afraid to eat or drink anything here. And it just, that kind of reaction.
You have in your hand what you tell me is called a short timer stick. Hold that up and tell us about that.
When you were in many of the guys, when you had 30 or fewer days left in your tour, you were authorized to buy a short timer stick. And this identified you as someone that was going to be leaving Vietnam, hopefully, soon. And you were treated like a god.
Tell me about that. How so?
Well, if I went for a meal and there was a line of 50 guys outside the mess hall, all I did was hold up the stick and everybody would get out of the way and I'd go to the front of the line. And people, I don't want to say respected you more, but you did get that kind of awe that you've done your time, you're going home, and it's just a great feeling.
turn that around a little so we can see that, and people at home can see that. Move it around. So
okay.
Tell me about the figure on there, and is it symbolic of anything?
Well, I picked this one because it looked, I don't know what I want to say, evil. Mm-hmm. But it's a dragon's head, and it's carved. It's about 1.5 feet long, with notches in it and everything. And they, to me, I don't know that they symbolize anything, but it's just the idea of having one. There were many varied types. Some didn't have the the carving on the top is elaborate, but that's why I picked this rascal.
But this was worth gold in Vietnam. This meant you're going home?
It was worth gold, maybe even more than gold, because yes, it said you were going home. You were treated with more respect. All of your short-timer jokes about I jumped out of bed today and landed in my boots and took me an hour to get out of there, people put up with because you were short, and it just was a great feeling.
Dennis, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more on his book about Vietnam right after this. Please stay with us. We're back and we're talking with a Vietnam veteran, Dennis Papp from Hamilton Township. He's written a book about his unusual experiences as a personnel clerk in Vietnam. It's called Fear Was My Only Weapon. And Dennis, what kind of reactions have you gotten to your story? Are they different depending on whether you were out in the field, you were a combat soldier, or you were not in the middle of the thick of it?
Well, the majority of them have been very favorable. Many of those who were, as myself, a support soldier, said, I can share this with my family so they get a better idea of what I was going through, that you just didn't dodge bullets all the time. Some of the guys who were actual infantrymen and whatnot were glad to see some of the realities of the, if you will, backstory of what they went up through every day, and not just bombs blowing up. There was just one, if you will, negative comment on about the individual thought there was too much humor or joking around. And when I mentioned this to some of my friends and co-veterans, they just were dumbfounded, because this was a way that we try to cope over there. Not you didn't take it seriously, but you had to have a sense of humor and try to forget about what was going on 24/7.
Which only makes sense, of course. You have some home movies that you shot of the camp. Just tell me briefly of what that camp was like where you were stationed.
Well, it was the headquarters for the 9th Infantry in a place called Bearcat, about 25 miles northeast of Saigon. There was a berm, hard-packed dirt with bunkers around the exterior, with fortifications of, machine guns and whatnot at the entry points, and barbed wire and everything outside the perimeter. Inside, it was basically mostly all tents with sandbags around it, and there were some 2-story wooden buildings where our, quote, offices were, and some of the other buildings, and everything was basically just hard-packed dirt.
Dennis, I read that you said this book is 98 to 99% true. What's the part that's not true?
Well, obviously I changed everyone's names, and the ones who were not the greatest of people, I gave them some good common names like John Smith, and I embellished the fact of their stupidity and inhumanity of the way they acted and treated us there. But except for that, everything is just the way it happened.
Are you still in touch with any of the guys you served with in Vietnam?
There are a couple that I am in touch with. One of them is a fellow that lives north of Green Bay. I went to school in Milwaukee, so whenever I go out there, I visit with him either up at his place or halfway down somewhere around Green Bay, and we write and email each other all the time.
That's got to be nice to stay in touch after all these years.
It really is, and he obviously is mentioned in the book, so he was glad for that.
Talk about your experience writing this book. What's your process? I know different authors do it differently. Did you make yourself sit for a certain amount of time every day?
Well, while I was in Vietnam, I kept a diary there, and the letters that I wrote to my wife, she kept, and I kept hers, so that when I came home, I basically sat down with all of that and outlined it more or less chronologically, and then decided what to say, what not to say in the various chapters, and just write it and rewrite it and rewrite it.
Talk about what kind of value that must have had to have those letters and to be able to feel all the stuff and read it as it was happening from back then.
Well, it made it obviously a lot easier for me to remember this, and also when I stopped crying over some of these things that I read and remembered, I was able to put that emotion, I hope, into the actual writing, so that it's not just a straight, story of of words, right? I try to put that in there because there was all of that emotion.
And talk about that. Where does that, after all these years, decades, it's still right there, isn't it?
It is. I know that when I first came home, every time I saw a flag, I would start crying. And as years went by, I was able to, let's say, deal with that a little better. But when I would read some of these things and think about it and everything, I would just sit there and start crying, and maybe you could hear it a little bit in my voice now that my voice is starting to break up, because I'm remembering some of these things. And when one of the things that kept us going was the music, the songs, and every time I hear a certain song that I either fell asleep to and cried myself to sleep over there, it just brings back that same feeling and emotion.
Dennis, what do you want people to take away from this book?
Well, I want them to know that there is more to war than just the, should we say, blood and guts side of it, to understand what everybody went through in every war zone, and to have respect for all veterans and to thank them for their freedom.
Because do you feel like that doesn't happen now, that veterans don't get the respect they should?
Well, I wouldn't say they don't, but it seems like more and more they are. Fortunately, when I came home from Nam, I was not greeted with boos and called a baby killer and everything. When I was on the plane coming home from California to Philly, the stewardess asked me if I'd like to sit up in first class, and I obviously said yes, and I remember one time, about a short while ago, a girl at the Acme came running out and just said thank you for your service.
And Dennis, I want to thank you for your service and for sharing your story with us. Again, the book is called Fear Was My Only Weapon. It's available in bookstores, on Amazon.com. And that's it for this edition of Perspective New Jersey. I'm Nora Muchanic. We'll see you again next time. So long.